Welcome to our training in basic principles of forensic interviewing. This training is for anyone who works with children who may have been sexually abused, including law enforcement personnel, social workers, and medical staff who perform physical examinations in child sexual abuse cases. The training is divided in 8 modules, and each module will address an important topic related to child sexual abuse interviewing, such as suggestibility, child development, and biasing interviewing techniques. For each module, we will present a set of learning objectives, and general guidelines will be given for each one of the learning objectives. The guidelines are practical ways in which to apply the information presented in this training. However, we want you to both understand the principles and their rationale. This means that we don't want you to blindly follow the guidelines, because at times there may be exceptions or modifications to be made. The idea for this training came from the author's work reviewing hundreds of forensic interviews. We understand that interviewing children who may have been sexually abused can be an incredibly difficult yet crucial task, given that the information gathered from forensic interviews is often one of the key pieces of evidence in a child sexual abuse investigation. Unfortunately, many of the interviews we have reviewed were less than competent, and this prompted us to create a training. Thus, the training may be used to develop a foundation of basic principles prior to being trained in a specific forensic interviewing protocol. It may also be used as a refresher for professionals who are already conducting forensic interviews with children. We hope that this training increases your knowledge of interviewing principles in order to conduct better interviews. Module 1. This module will explore implications of child development for forensic interviewing. We will look at factors that influence development and processes that vary with developmental level. The ability to understand language, recall memories, and sustain attention grows as the child ages. This is important to understand when interviewing children who may be as young as 2 and as old as 16. Thus, our learning objectives are recognizing that children of the same age may be at different developmental levels, understanding how communication, especially receptive and expressive speech, is affected by developmental level, learning how to use age-appropriate questions with children, understanding how memory is affected by developmental level, exploring how attention span is affected by developmental level, and understanding how developmental disabilities affect a child's development and therefore affect the forensic interview. Children are not just tiny adults. They think and communicate differently from adults. A child's age is generally used to indicate the child's developmental level. However, it would be unwise to assume that all 10-year-old children are at the same developmental level. Some have developed faster and some slower. This is because all sorts of things can impact child development, like genetics, health, culture, gender, disabilities, socioeconomic status, daycare attendance, and many other factors. The main implication of differing developmental levels is that you have to approach each child as an individual and gain some estimate of the child's developmental level. You cannot go into a forensic interview assuming a lot about a child simply because you know his or her age. Instead, you must pay attention to how the child uses words, what they seem to understand and not understand, and how long they can pay attention. The rapport building portion of the interview is a good time to do this. We will teach you how to build rapport with the child in Module 6. During rapport building, you are asking the child open-ended questions about positive events. These open-ended questions encourage the child from the beginning to provide their answers in a narrative form rather than a 1 or 2 word answer. However, how detailed the narrative will be also depends on the child's developmental level. So here are some questions to ask yourself. Does the child's vocabulary seem more advanced or more delayed from children of the same age? Does the child seem to have difficulties understanding more complex sentences, for example, sentences that are longer or have more clauses in them? Are the children's answers expressed in a manner that seems developmentally normal? Does the child seem more easily distracted than other children his or her age? The key here is not to judge the child, but simply to understand how to best match their level of development. You want to make sure you're not talking over their heads or confusing them in any way. As opposed to older children and adolescents, younger children have more limited vocabularies, are less descriptive in their statements, meaning that they use simple sentences that don't have as many adjectives and adverbs, and don't pronounce words as well, meaning that you may not understand what they're saying at times. Here are some concrete strategies to deal with children with limited communication abilities. Use very short sentences with no embedded clauses. Use easy words. Mirror the child's words. If they use the word house for their apartment, continue to use the word house. Use people's names, the name of places, etc. instead of pronouns that might confuse the child. Try to speak in an interesting or animated way to maintain the child's interest, and take frequent breaks. Corner House, an organization that evaluates children who may have been sexually abused, uses a set of guidelines regarding what questions can be asked of children of various ages. For example, it recommends that you only ask the questions who and what of children aged 3 and avoid where or when. The American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children guidelines also cautions against using when or how many times with young children. Developmental level does vary, and while some 3-year-olds may not be able to answer a where or when question, others might. These guidelines are just that, recommendations for what questions to ask children of different ages. There are not rules that are set in stone and that we expect you to follow blindly. Thus, the earlier recommendation to treat each child as an individual should supersede any others. Overall, it is important to remember there are questions that some children simply won't understand, and you are better off sticking to simple questions when working with young children. Simple questions contain a subject and a verb. For example, what did he do and who was at home? Also, remember that children of all ages can provide some free recall information without the use of who, what, where, and when questions. The goal should be to try to get as much information without having to rely on those types of questions, which we consider to be closed rather than open-ended. Next, we're going to talk about memory. Memory is greatly affected by language, and younger children are clearly limited in this. Kathleen Fowler, a researcher in child sexual abuse at the University of Michigan, notes that younger children generally provide impoverished reports relative to older children, and this is due to limited retrieval skills, meaning retrieving information out of memory, reduced language abilities, because memories can be stored linguistically, and if you cannot remember you rode a motorcycle until you have a linguistic category of motorcycle, and immature narrative skills, which is the ability to verbalize a sequence that makes sense to the listener. Dr. Fowler advises not to question children younger than 10 about when something happened, but instead to tie the question to a familiar event such as breakfast. For example, you could ask, did this happen before breakfast, after breakfast, or some other time? This is much more concrete and less abstract than a when question. Always try open-ended questions several times to see if the child can answer these. In spite of young children's reduced abilities to recall and hence to report on a past event, Professor Lamb and his team at the University of Cambridge highlight that even children as young as 4 can provide substantial information about abuse in response to free recall prompts such as, "Tell me what happened." When we say substantial, in regards to preschool children, what we really mean is that they can tell you who did something, what the individual did, and where. For example, a 4-year-old may tell you that his grandpa touched his wee-wee in his bedroom. You can continue to probe for more details by asking the 4-year-old to tell you everything about that from beginning to end, and throughout the narrative by asking, "And then what happened?" and "What happened next?" As a result, the child might tell you that grandpa pulled his pants down and rubbed his wee-wee, that this happened at home when his mommy was at work, and that it felt nasty. However, the 4-year-old may not be able to tell you that this happened on May 23rd at 12:30 p.m. or even that it was in the middle of the day. However, be aware that young children may have difficulties understanding the source of their knowledge or memory, leaving them prone to misattribution. Source memory is defined as knowing where the memory came from. If you are concerned with the source of a child's memory, you can ask him or her how they came to know that. For example, if the child says that his daddy put his wee-wee in his sissy's mouth, you can ask, "How do you know that daddy did that? Were you there? What did you see with your own eyes? What did you hear with your own ears?" Please note that really young children may not be able to understand these questions, but that doesn't mean that the details should be completely ignored. Related to memory is attention span. Young children definitely cannot maintain the same attention span as older ones, or as adults. This means that interviews with young children should be limited to a shorter amount of time, often under half an hour, while interviews with older children can go longer, for example, an hour or more. It is important to attend to any signs that attention is diminishing, such as the child no longer listening to your questions and breaking eye contact. Asking younger children if they need a break is crucial, as they may get tired, hungry, need to use the bathroom, and fail to let you know. The presence of a mental disorder, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, can also affect how long the child can sustain attention in an interview. Unfortunately, there really isn't any research that gives us the right length of an interview for any given age or developmental level. That means that you have to use your best judgment for how long to continue the interview. It also means that you must use interview time effectively. If you notice that the child is getting tired, is no longer paying attention, and that efforts to refocus him or her are failing, you may want to terminate the interview. One last item that must be addressed regarding child development is the presence of a cognitive developmental disorder. Developmental disorders refers to a group of disorders that generally start early in the child's life, usually before he or she goes to school, and that interfere with the child's personal, social, and academic functioning. These include, but are not limited to, intellectual disabilities, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and specific learning disorders. Developmental disorders may significantly affect the child's ability to remember events, communicate, sustain attention span, and so on. In some cases, developmental disorders significantly affect the child's developmental level, such as in the case of autism spectrum disorder. In others, the child's developmental level may not be greatly decreased, such as in the case of ADHD, but certain accommodations may still have to be made. Additionally, research has shown that children with developmental disabilities are more suggestible than children with normal intellectual functioning and those who do not face any behavioral or learning challenges. Thus, it is best if you can consult with someone familiar with the child, like a parent, teacher, or physician, in order to determine what accommodations are required for each specific child in order to set up a successful interview. For example, if you interview a child who needs accommodations at school because he or she has average intelligence but has trouble with auditory processing, you may need to check in regularly with the child to ensure that he or she understands your questions. If instead this is a child who understands everything but has a bad speech articulation defect only, you may need to give him extra time to answer questions and not rush forward, assuming that he or she is done answering. These are great reasons to involve family, schools, and pediatricians, even just one you can curbside consult before you go into the interview, and to have a team approach. In conclusion, these are some things to consider when working with children. Younger children, children with ADHD, and other mental or developmental disorders have a shorter attention span than older children and those without such disorders. Developmental disabilities may require you to react not to their chronological age, but to their actual developmental level. Younger children may have a difficult time identifying the source of their memory. Younger children may also have more limited vocabularies and use simpler sentences. Younger children think in more concrete terms, and in spite of all this, young children can provide a lot of information correctly when appropriate questions are used. And here are some general principles about how to interact with children in a developmentally appropriate manner. Do treat each child as an individual. Do notice if the child has stopped paying attention and try to refocus him or her, or take a break. Do rely on open-ended questions and prompts like, "Tell me all about," with children of all ages. Do not rely on closed-ended prompts. Do tie abuse-related events to a familiar event, such as breakfast, when asking younger children about the time of day for an event. Do tie an event to an important date, such as the child's birthday or a holiday, when trying to get the month or time of year for an event. Do consult with sources like parents, teachers, and doctors who know the child, can speak to his or her level of linguistic and cognitive functioning, and can recommend any necessary accommodations when working with a child with developmental disabilities. And do stick to simple questions when working with younger children. Now let's move on to one of the most important and best researched topics in child sexual abuse interviewing, suggestibility. Module 2. The following module will focus on understanding suggestibility and its implications for forensic interviewing. The learning objectives for this module are defining suggestibility, providing a historical context for how suggestibility came to be an area of focus for forensic interviewing, understanding how prevalent suggestibility is, understanding that suggestibility can occur before the interviewer even interacts with the child, and this must be explored, understanding that even the interviewer can induce suggestibility, and this must be minimized, and explaining implications of suggestibility for the interviewing. Suggestibility is when one's memories are influenced by the behavior or suggestions of others rather than by what actually happened. Suggestibility refers to both deliberate and unintentional influences. Suggestibility is not just a theory. It is a very well-researched phenomenon. There are literally over 100 studies that show robust suggestibility effects in both children and adults. We must consider suggestibility because suggestible influences can occur both within and outside of the forensic interview. Although suggestibility is one of the most important principles to understand when conducting interviews with children who may have been abused, a full review of the research is unnecessary and beyond the scope of this training. A significant portion of this content has been taken from the writings of leading researchers in the field of suggestibility, including Dr. C.C. and Bruck, and can be found in their book, Jeopardy in the Courtroom. Let's look at a study that shows how suggestibility can affect the forensic interview. Bruck, C.C., Melnick, and Finkelberg evaluated the interviews with 120 preschool children, 90 of whom attended a birthday party with a visitor, and 30 children who did not attend the party. Interviewers were informed that the children had participated in an activity with the visitor, but not what the activity was. Each interviewer individually questioned 4 children to discover what the child had done with the visitor. The interviewers did not know that the first 3 children that they interviewed had been at the birthday party, but the 4th had not. After questioning the first 3 children who had attended the party, interviewers wrongly assumed that the 4th child had also attended the party. Next, they unintentionally engaged in biased questioning with the 4th child in an apparent attempt to confirm their faulty preconceptions that this child too had attended the birthday party. In response to these suggestive interviews, 60% of children made false claims to have been at the party when they hadn't. 85% of interviewers wrongly concluded that all 4 of the children they questioned had attended the party. How might this be translated to actual interviews with children who may have been abused? When a child is brought in for a forensic interviewer, some interviewers can and do assume that the child wouldn't be there if nothing happened to him or her. This results in the interviewer engaging in biased questioning to confirm that faulty misconception that the child was abused, and this may lead to the child making false statements. The first study on children's suggestibility was conducted by Laurie Small. In an 1896 study, Small opened a bottle of clear liquid and asked children if they could smell the fragrance. What the children didn't know was that the liquid was water. However, many of the children claimed that they could still smell the fragrance. Suggestibility research continued over the decades, then decreased in the middle of the 20th century. The late 1970s saw a renewed interest in this area. This was influenced by both an increase in child sexual abuse reports and a need to distinguish true from false reports. Once people found out that sexual abuse was more common than previously thought, they started using whatever methods they could to get a disclosure from the child, including what we now know as suggestive questions. Part of this was motivated by the reasonable belief that disclosing abuse is difficult, and thus an adult could ask repeated questions, could provide information before the child does. For example, was it Father John who touched you? And could inadvertently bribe the child. For example, if you tell, I'll take you to McDonald's. Early research showed that children are more accurate during free recall or free narrative than when asked specific questions. Free recall means that the child tells you everything that happened about a certain topic, and the only question you ask is something along the lines of, "Tell me what happened." The problem was that children, especially younger ones, did not provide a lot of information during free recall. This led to some interviewers in child sexual abuse cases to use other approaches, like asking leading and repetitive questions to get more information. Leading questions are ones that encourage or prompt an answer by providing information before the child does. The serious issues with using those questions and other problematic techniques came to light in a series of high-profile daycare cases in the 80s and 90s. These included the infamous McMartin trial and Kelly Michaels preschool trial. Reviews of videotapes of the interviews in the McMartin trial indicated that child advocate Key McFarland had relied heavily on a number of suggestive interviewing techniques that elicited false allegations of child sexual abuse. The goal of any interview should be to elicit what the child wants to say, which is hopefully exactly what did happen. It should never be to get the child to say what the adult wants to hear. These cases spawned decades of research in the area of suggestibility, and the overall findings indicate that children of all ages can be suggestible, as well as adults. To what extent are children actually suggestible? In regards to prevalence, research indicates that the rate of suggestibility varies widely based on several factors. Age is one of these, with the general finding that younger children are more suggestible than older ones, who are more suggestible than adults. Another factor is the manipulation used in the study. This refers to what researchers are varying across conditions. This could be repetitive versus non-repetitive questions, leading versus non-leading questions, a suggestion that other children said something similar, and so on. If some of these terms seem foreign to you, don't worry, they will all be explained by the end of the training. When we talk about younger children being more suggestible, we want to give you some idea of these numbers. Some studies showed that nearly 90% of the children were suggestible, and some studies showed 20 or 40%. But the point is that this is not a rare phenomenon. Often, with very minimal suggestive influence, a very large percentage of children form false memories and repeat these as true. However, please be aware that the idea of forming a false memory is different from, and usually subsequent to, verbal acceptance of suggestion. Not all children who accept a suggestion in their verbal report will also form a false memory. It is important to note that reporting a false memory due to suggestibility is not the same as lying. Lying involves knowingly and intentionally saying false information. When a child who has had suggestive influences reports a false memory, they are not lying. They think that what they're telling is true, but it is not. Furthermore, children are more likely to accept a suggestion when it comes from an authority figure. This is a shade of gray, but most would not consider it lying, depending on the developmental level of the child. In order to truly understand suggestibility, It is important to know that suggestibility might be introduced prior to the interviewer even meeting with the child. Children may talk about the allegations with many individuals, including parents, caregivers, siblings, friends, law enforcement, and teachers. All of these could have been well-intentioned, but these interactions may have contained potentially suggestive content that could result in the child incorporating false information into subsequent statements. For example, a caregiver might engage in repetitive questioning before the child has even made the allegations. There was a case in which a mother saw her daughter next to her grandfather covered by a blanket, pulled her aside, and asked, "Did anyone touch you? Are you sure no one did? What about Grandpa Larry? Are you sure he didn't touch you? No, you can tell me if he did, and we can make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else. Now, did he touch your privates?" The child consistently replied no. First of all, this kind of questioning is suggestive because it asks the child about an inappropriate touch before the child has made any disclosure. This type of questioning is also suggestive because it's repetitive. Repetitive questions have been shown to increase the rate of inaccurate statements because they can make the child change his or her answers. Asking a question more than once can communicate that the first answer was not correct and another answer is expected. Repetitive questions will be discussed more thoroughly in Module 6, Avoiding Interview Mistakes. Let's look at a famous study that shows how the false information parents or caregivers suggest to their children can result in false statements. Poole and Lindsay had preschool-aged children witness 4 science demonstrations in a university lab. 4 months later, the researchers mailed the parents stories that contained descriptions of the children's visits to their lab. 2 of the stories were true and 2 were false, meaning that they described experiments that the children had not seen. Each story finished with a fake ending of what happened when it was time to leave the lab. It read, "Mr. Science wiped the child's hands and face with a wet wipe. The cloth got close to the child's mouth and tasted really yucky." Parents read the story to their children 3 times. Later, children told their experimenters that they had participated in demonstrations that they had not, meaning the false stories read by their parents. More than half of the participants said that Mr. Science had wiped their mouths, and many elaborated on these answers. When asked if Mr. Science had actually wiped their mouths or if their mothers just read their story, 71% of the children maintained that it really happened. The study was replicated by the researchers using children from a wider age range, and findings were similar except that they found that when asked if Mr. Science wiped their mouths or if their mothers just read the story, the older children tended to change their reports and said that their mother told them. Nevertheless, some of the older children still maintained that they had witnessed the false acts themselves. Before you exclaim that these are all young children and that there's no way older ones would ever make such mistakes, let's review a study conducted by University of California, Irvine researcher named Elizabeth Loftus and her colleague Jacqueline Pickrell in 1995 with adults. The researchers recruited 24 participants who were presented with 4 stories from when they were between 4 and 6 years old. 3 stories were true and 1 was false. To get the true stories, the researchers spoke to the participants' relatives to get 3 events for each person that had really happened. Each family was also asked to provide the circumstances of another event that could have happened but didn't. In each case, the false memory was for getting lost in a shopping mall. Relatives provided details of a specific shopping mall along with details to make the fake story plausible. They also confirmed that the event like this had not actually occurred. The researchers told participants that they were involved in a study about their ability to recall details of childhood memories. Each participant was first sent a written description of the 4 events the relatives had outlined, 3 real and 1 fake. They were then asked to write down which events they remembered and more details of the events. Afterwards, they were interviewed and reminded of the 4 memories and asked to recall as much as they could about them. At a second later interview, a similar procedure was followed. At the end of both interviews, participants rated the clarity of their memories. The researchers revealed to the participants that one of the memories was false, and they were asked to guess which one it was. Of the 24 adults, 5 falsely recalled the made-up lost in a mall story as a real memory. This study shows that even adults are susceptible to producing false memories in response to being presented with misleading information and subsequently questioned. Suggestibility can also be introduced during the forensic interview through the use of non-evidence-based techniques. Attention was first brought to biasing interviewing techniques after the Kelly Michaels preschool trial previously mentioned. Here are several portions of one of the interviews. Do you think that Kelly was not good when she was hurting you all? Wasn't hurting me. I like her. I can't hear you. You've got to look at me when you talk to me. Now when Kelly was bothering the kids in the music room? I got socks off. What went wrong in this interview? The interviewer clearly suggested the information to the child that the child hadn't mentioned, specifically that Kelly was hurting the child. In this case, suggestibility is defined as when the interviewer provides information before the child has. A better approach would have been to, from the beginning, ask the child why he was there and avoid the above questioning altogether. The interviewer could have also asked the child to tell her about Kelly, but not before the Kelly topic was brought up by the child. It also appears that the interviewer became more stern after the child denied that Kelly hurt him. This is suggestive because it provides differential consequences to the child. It basically punishes exculpatory responses. Let's look at a portion of another interview. Did she make anybody take their clothes off in the music room? No. Yes. No. In this one, the interviewer is clearly contradicting the child and not accepting his no response. This is suggestive because the interviewer is disconfirming the child's responses. It communicates that the no response is not acceptable and another response is sought. Researchers at University of Texas El Paso who examined these transcripts identified 6 problematic techniques that the interviewers relied on: suggestive questions, other people, positive-negative consequences asked and answered, and inviting speculation. These will all be described in Module 7, Avoiding Problematic Techniques. These techniques were put to the test by Garvin and her colleagues in 2000. 66 children participated in a demonstration in which a Confederate, Manny Morales, read a story and gave the children a sticker, a napkin, and a cupcake. A week later, the children participated in interviews about their experience with Manny, in which the researchers tested 2 conditions: the social incentive condition utilizing the McMartin techniques, and a suggestive control condition in which they only used suggestive questions. The other kids say that Manny told them a secret and said not to tell anyone. Did Manny tell you a secret and tell you not to tell anyone? Think really hard. The other kids say he did. Did Manny tell you a secret and tell you not to tell anyone? Try really hard to remember. Do you think that maybe he had a secret and told you not to tell anyone? Maybe. Okay. That's a help. The questions above are problematic and suggestive because they pressure the child into agreeing with the interviewer. They also disconfirm the child's responses, communicating to the child that the first answer or multiple answers were wrong. Children in the social incentive condition produce significantly more false allegations about Manny Morales' wrongdoings than in the control condition. One critique of these studies has been that they don't have real-life applications. After all, in these studies, children were interviewed about relatively harmless events. It is highly improbable, or even impossible, that the same results would have been obtained if children were asked questions about their bodies, touching of the genitals, or some type of abuse. Thankfully, some researchers rose to this challenge. Results of these studies made it clear that children also made false statements due to suggestibility when their own bodies were involved, and even in cases of potential abuse. Goodman and colleagues interviewed 108 children ages 3 to 15 who were suspected to have experienced abuse and who were examined at a hospital. Children first received a medical checkup, then an anal genital examination, and were swabbed for culture. 3 days later, the children were interviewed, and some of the questions were misleading or suggestive. When asked misleading questions about abusive or inappropriate behavior by the doctor or nurse, for example, how many times did the doctor kiss you? 3 to 5-year-olds gave false statements to 21% of the questions. Older children did better, with 6 to 9-year-olds answering 16% of misleading abuse questions incorrectly. 11 to 15-year-olds answered 9% of those questions incorrectly. Whichever age group you look at, these numbers are pretty significant considering the real-life implications of children answering 1/5 to 1/10 of abuse-related questions incorrectly, even with this slight suggestibility. Imagine what would happen if a child is subjected to suggestible influences multiple times a week over a few months. Similar studies have been conducted and have found comparable results. In spite of the studies that were just mentioned, some have argued that there is no evidence that interviewers today are using all these problematic techniques, and as a result, the topic of children's suggestibility no longer requires attention. Unfortunately, personal experience working on child sexual abuse interviews indicates that that is not the case. Evaluating hundreds of poorly conducted interviews is what led us to create the training in the first place. These critics are right about one thing. Actual empirical research on forensic interviews is somewhat lacking. We do have some information about what questions interviewers ask from a team of researchers that includes Dr. Lamb and his colleagues. This team trained interviewers in both the United States and Israel in a forensic interviewing protocol. Their goal was to reduce the number of leading and suggestive questions that they ask, specifically because these questions lead to inaccurate information. An example of a suggestive question is, "He forced you to do that, didn't he?" However, even after extensive training, too many interviewers continue to rely on the poor questions. This research, combined with anecdotal data, tells us that to this day, some interviewers are still using techniques that could introduce suggestibility and contaminate the child's report. We mentioned initially that doing a full review of all studies on suggestibility was beyond the scope of the training. That is because there are dozens of studies on children's suggestibility, and here we discuss just a few. If you are interested in reading more about this, check out the article titled "The Suggestibility of Children's Memories," written by Dr. C.C.M. Brooke, or the book Jeopardy in the Courtroom, written by Dr. C.C. Although these were both written approximately 20 years ago, the research presented in these texts continues to impact the field of forensic interviewing today. What are the implications of the research we have just discussed, and what are some important takeaway points? The first thing to know is that suggestibility can occur at all ages, although younger children tend to be more suggestible than older adults and older children. This means that children of all ages could be exposed to misinformation that they later incorporate into their own statements and report as true. But just conducting your interview in a non-suggestive manner is not enough. You must also question the child about whether others have interacted with him or her in a suggestive manner. Thus, suggestibility has two implications for the forensic interview. Don't do anything suggestive in the interview, and ask if others have. Let's explore these more. First, it is important to remember that suggestibility does not indicate intentionality, meaning that a child knowingly takes the false information from elsewhere and passes it as true. When asked about the source of their memory, they even have a hard time telling where that information came from in the first place. Suggestibility really challenges the ideas that some have about children never lying, never making mistakes about potential abuse or about acts involving their bodies, and so on. It is a concept that you as an interviewer must be aware of because it is your job to minimize suggestibility. This brings us to the first implication of suggestibility. The fact that it can occur before you, as the forensic interviewer, have even met the child indicates that the child's statements could have already been contaminated before he or she has even gone through a forensic interview. Remember that many times the child has talked to other individuals about the allegations. These include parents, friends, counselors, police officers, and others. Rather than ignoring these potentially problematic conversations, you must question the child about his or her memories of each and every one of these conversations. Although we have mostly focused on suggestibility as it relates to children making false statements of having been abused, interactions with parents, police, and others could also go the other way. Some parents, when told about a spouse's abuse against one of their children, don't believe their child. This could also result in very problematic questioning by the parent, along with accusations that the child is lying. For example, a mother might ask, "Are you sure he touched you? I don't believe you. There's no way he would have done that. Why are you lying? Stop lying. I need you to tell me the truth right now." In order to determine whether suggestibility has occurred prior to the forensic interview, whether causing the child to falsely assent that something happened or falsely deny it, here's a list of questions you could ask. Tell me to whom you've talked about what happened. Can you think of anyone else to whom you talked about? Tell me everything you can remember about the talk you had with your friend, parent, counselor, officer, etc. Tell me everything you said. Tell me what your friend, parent, counselor, officer, etc. said to you. How did he react when you told him about what happened? Tell me all about his reaction. You can then ask the same questions about each individual with whom the child talked. Module 7, Generating and Testing Alternative Hypotheses in the Forensic Interview, further explores parental suggestion and outside contamination, both sources of suggestibility. The other implication of suggestibility is that you must actively work in the interview to minimize your own suggestion to the child. Remember the birthday party study discussed earlier that revealed that when interviewers have preconceived notions about what happened, they ask questions in order to confirm those notions, and this can ultimately affect the accuracy of the statements the child provides. This indicates that it is best to go blind into an interview, meaning having no prior information about the allegations in order to avoid making assumptions about what happened and attaching to those assumptions. Thus, your work to reduce suggestibility starts from even before you conduct the interview. It continues to the very beginning of the interview when you first establish rapport with the child, then on to when you go over the rules, such as using I don't know responses and promising to only talk about the truth. Module 6, Setting the Stage of the Interview, will walk you through these steps. However, your behavior through the remainder of the interview also has the potential to introduce suggestibility to the child. This includes the questions that you ask as well how you react to what the child tells you. For example, if the child tells you that nothing bad happened to him or her, but you challenge this and say, "I don't think you're being frank with me right now. I really need you to tell me what happened." This could lead to the child telling you that something happened when it really didn't. Conversely, the child may tell you that something did happen, but you don't think that this is possible because the child's older sister first made allegations, and this child's allegations are too similar. You could think that the child is just copying her older sister and say, "Are you sure that something happened? It's important you only tell the truth. Does something really happen to you?" The point is, you have the ability to introduce suggestion to the child, and you must be careful not to do that. If you stick with evidence-based practices and avoid biasing ones, you will be well on your way to conducting a good interview. Module 7, Avoiding Interviewing Mistakes, gives you practical guidelines for what biasing practices to avoid that could introduce suggestibility in the interview. This module on suggestibility has hopefully helped you understand that children of all ages can make false statements when they have been presented with misleading information and when questioned in specific ways. This also introduced an idea that by now may not be so shocking after all, that in some cases, children are not truthful about what happened to them. This could mean falsely denying that something would happen, falsely claiming that something happened, and other possibilities. Let's explore this in more detail in Module 3. But first, here are guidelines for how to avoid suggestibility in the interview. Do ask open-ended questions, such as "tell me more about that." These are not suggestive. Do not mention something first, for example, by asking the child if anyone touched him inappropriately. Do not disconfirm the child's answers or say that there's no way something could or could not have happened. Do not ask the child to pretend or speculate. Do not ask a question repeatedly. This implies that the first answer was not acceptable. Do not ask leading questions. Do not use conformity press or peer pressure. Do not reward a child for abuse consistent with details. Do not punish the child for abuse in inconsistent details. Do ask the child with whom he or she has talked about the allegations. Do ask the child to recall all details about each one of these conversations. And do look for possible suggestions in these conversations. Possible suggestions in outside conversations may include repetitive questions, especially after initial denials, disconfirmation, rewards for telling that abuse occurred, punishment for not disclosing that abuse occurred or for disclosing that abuse did occur, leading questions such as a parent asking, "Did Uncle John touch you?" Social conformity press, meaning saying, "Sally and Jimmy said that Uncle Judge touched them. Did he touch you too?" Emotionality, such as a parent being upset at non-disclosure or relieved at disclosure. Stake, such as a custody battle, or secondary gain, such as the child getting a lot of attention for the disclosure. Module 3. We left Module 2 with the idea that in some cases, children aren't always accurate about what happened to them. Some say they weren't abused when they in fact were. Others say that someone abused them when no one really did. Yet others make inconsistent statements and say it happened 4 times, but in reality it was 10. Of course, the goal of the interview is to attempt to gain only accurate information. This brings us to the core module, which will focus on understanding disclosures of sexual abuse, false allegations, denials of actual abuse, and true and false recantations. Each one of these will be defined, relevant scientific research summarized, and why it's important that you are aware of these discussed. The learning objectives for this module are understanding the process of disclosure of child sexual abuse, exploring plausible alternatives to the hypothesis that the child was abused and correctly reported this, understanding false allegations, understanding false denials, understanding recantations, and exploring confirmation bias in forensic interviewing. As you have probably figured out by now, the field of child sexual abuse is not as black and white as one might think. In a perfect world, there would always be a clear and convincing evidence of the sexual abuse, and children will always be perfectly accurate about what happened. However, in some cases, whether a child was in fact abused isn't quite as straightforward. Research indicates that only about 4% of all child sexual abuse investigations produce definitive medical evidence of sexual contact, such as DNA, genital injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, or pregnancy. In addition, there is rarely another witness to the abuse or documentary evidence like a videotape. And medical evidence is often absent because children sometimes don't report the abuse right away. The majority of children delay their disclosure for at least 6 months and oftentimes for years. Acts perpetrated did not involve penetration or other physically violent acts that cause significant physical injury, and or children's bodies are very resilient and can heal incredibly quickly even if penetration did occur. An interesting study of 36 pregnant teenagers by Kellogg and colleagues discovered that only 2 of those had findings definitive of penile penetration and 8 had questionable, unclear findings. That means that most of the pregnant teenagers, who we know had intercourse, didn't even have physical findings consistent with penetration. Further complicating this problem is that delays in reporting are common and disclosure may not occur for years. Non-disclosure rates are common as well, with rates ranging between 49% and 69%. Research shows that many disclosures happen weeks or months after the event, which has obvious implications for how good some memories will be. Some children make false allegations, and while no 2 studies have come up with the same percentages for how many allegations are actually false, the range is between 1 and 56%. Some children who have been sexually abused might deny that they were abused. These are called false denials and have been found to take place in between 2 and 72% of cases. Lastly, some children first disclose abuse, then take it back. These are called retractions or recantations and occur between 4 and 28% of the time. You might wonder about these very large ranges. For example, how one study can find that 1% of cases are false allegations and another 72%. This is because each study uses different samples of children. For example, children who were found to have an STD or whose parents are currently going through a custody battle, different methodologies and different ways of measuring variables, such as truthfulness and falsehood. By that we mean that some studies asked professionals, such as social workers, whether they thought the children were being truthful, while others looked directly at properties of the child's statement, and while others looked at whether the children admitted to lying. But the takeaway is that because it is possible that what the child is saying is not completely true, it is reasonable to explore information that might allow you to rule in or rule out claims that what the child is stating is not actually true. So what can you do if you're aware that the child has recanted his or her statements? A recantation essentially produces inconsistent statements. First, the child makes the allegation, then states that it wasn't true. When you interview the child, you must address this rather than ignore it. One way you might do this is like this. So you initially told a police officer that Uncle John touched you, but now you're saying that he didn't. I'd like to better understand what happened. Can you explain to me what led to you changing your answer? Please note that counterclaims that what the child is saying is not completely true is not unexpected. Abusers will often deny that they committed the child's sexual abuse, sometimes pointing to the quality of the interview. If the case goes to trial, there's no doubt that a defense attorney will also do this. Thus, you will be more objective and better be able to defend the quality of your forensic interview if you explore the possibility of false reporting. Why spend all this time talking about false allegations, denials, and so on if we don't even know how often these happen? Because it's really important for you to be aware that there's a universe of possible conclusions regarding whether a child was in fact sexually abused. Interviews can make two types of error: either falsely concluding that a child has not been abused when in fact they have, and these are called false negatives, or a lack of sensitivity in the forensic interview, or falsely concluding that a child has been abused when they have not. These are called false positives, or a lack of specificity in the forensic interview. Both types of errors need to be minimized. Asking questions about other possibilities related to the child's assertions is an attempt to decrease these kinds of error in the interviewing process. It is in no way anti-child or pro-defense. It is being objective, comprehensive, and thorough. The interviewer needs to be objective and find out what the child has to say about a number of possibilities, both potentially incriminating for the alleged abuser and potentially exculpatory. For example, the sooner you reveal and clarify any inconsistencies in a child disclosure, the better clarity both sides of the legal system will have in doing their job. In doing this, the interview will not only stand up better in court, but be more credible. Equally important, this allows the other members of the multidisciplinary team to best support the child and family and address their needs early on in the process. Remember that asking about these possibilities does not mean that you are trying to find that the child was not abused. It does, however, mean that you are trying to be fair and thorough. Whether it throws perhaps legitimate doubt on the child's allegations depends on what the child says. It does not depend on the mere fact that you are asking these questions. For example, if one asks, as the previous module suggests, about prior conversations with others that might be suggestive, this does not mean that one automatically will throw doubt on the child's allegations. This is because the child may give you benign information, such as, "My mom said, you look a little sad, do you want to talk? And then I just told her about Uncle John and what he did." There is no way, then, that this information could be used to show that the child was exposed to suggestive influences. In fact, your interview will be more believable because you covered this ground. Your interview was more thorough and objective. Not considering this alternative possibilities can lead to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias refers to selectively seeking, focusing on, and attaching greater weight to evidence that supports rather than refutes one's own beliefs. Specific to child sexual abuse, interviewers often assume that because they're about to interview a child, that must mean that the child was in fact abused. This can be reasonable because the interviewer may work in a setting where a lot of kids do disclose abuse. It may also be reasonable because there may be prior information that is indicative of abuse. For example, a mother brings her 8-year-old daughter to be interviewed. The mother reports that she's noticed behavioral changes, including bedwetting and talking back, which, by the way, are not validated independent indicators of sexual abuse. And she thinks someone may have touched her daughter. This could lead to the interviewer asking questions in a way that confirms the idea that the child was abused, while discounting any evidence that he or she was not. For example, the interviewer might want to ask the child if anyone touched her inappropriately or if anyone did something that made her feel bad or scared. If the child hasn't given this information already, this type of questioning could be suggestive and may elicit an inaccurate answer from the child. Or this may lead to focusing on one hypothesis, for example, that the biological father did it, and ask questions only about that when the truth could be that someone else was the abuser. For example, the stepfather, or that no one did it. This is really dangerous because it could lead to false conclusions about whether the child was abused that have very serious consequences in the real world. Not only may an individual who didn't commit these acts end up incarcerated, but also someone who in fact did abuse the child might end up free. Once more, recall the birthday study described in the module on suggestibility. In that study, interviewers wrongly assumed that all children attended a birthday party, when in fact only some of them had. As a result, the biased interviewers unintentionally engaged in suggestive questionings that resulted in the children giving false statements. The study showed how even well-intentioned child interviewers can become biased based on their expectations associated with confirmation bias and then use suggestive interviewing techniques to extract false statements from the children. Before you say, there's no way that a child would accuse the wrong person or any person when he or she wasn't actually abused, remember that sometimes children do lie about being sexually abused. Perhaps this doesn't happen at a very high rate, but you do have to worry about this some of the time, and it would be a good idea to rule it out. More shocking is that sometimes they don't even know that they're doing this, and that their false reports might be the result of suggestive influences that they're not aware of. Because of this, you must go into the interview with a very open mind and allow the child to give you as much information as possible via free narrative before asking specific questions about who, what, where, and when. Here are some guidelines for how to overcome your own confirmation bias. Do take a neutral stance in the interview. This refers to that blind interviewer. Do not make any antecedent assumptions about whether the child was or was not abused. This may be best achieved by remaining uninformed regarding the details of the allegation. Do use open-ended questions to get information from the child. By this we mean ask the child to tell you about what happened from beginning to end without missing any details. Do not rely on closed-ended questions. These are the who, what, where, when, yes or no, and multiple choice questions for details, and avoid leading and repetitive questions. Question types will be further explored in Module 6, Avoiding Interviewing Mistakes. Do let the child know that you do not know what happened to him or her, because you weren't there and it is up to them to tell you everything. Do recognize the possibility that the child may be making a false allegation, false denial, recantation, and therefore do explore alternative hypotheses for the child's statement. For example, in cases where the child has made an inconsistent statement, which by definition, statements like that cannot all be true. A hypothesis testing approach is the key to overcoming confirmation bias. In child sexual abuse interviewing, hypothesis testing refers to evaluating all plausible explanations about the allegations, not just the ones that confirm the idea that the child was abused. The forensic interview is an information gathering process, and you should attempt to gather information that rules in or out all reasonable possibilities. This also means asking questions about other viable hypotheses, such as that someone coached the child or that someone had something to gain from the allegations. Being able to rule out such hypotheses, for example that someone coached the child, will strengthen the conclusions you can make about the accuracy of the child's statements. This hypothesis testing approach will be discussed in more detail in the next module. Module 4. As previously mentioned, a hypothesis testing approach to the forensic interview can help overcome engaging in confirmation bias. It is a fair and objective way because information relevant to evaluating the truth of multiple hypotheses is gathered, rather than focusing on information for only one hypothesis. Let's illustrate confirmation bias in an example. A parent brings in her daughter and says that she has now been wanting to go visit her father, and every time she is asked to go there, she throws a temper tantrum. The parent asks her daughter several times if her father did something bad to her, and after repeatedly saying no, the daughter eventually answered yes. The interviewer assumes that the father has been molesting the child and asks the following questions. I heard your mother was concerned about you going to your dad's house. Something bad happening there? How come you don't want to visit your dad? Has he been doing something bad to you? Has anyone done something to make you feel uncomfortable? Has your dad made you feel uncomfortable? How has your dad been touching you in inappropriate ways? Asking questions solely focused on whether the father did something bad or inappropriate ignores the other possibilities for why the child might not want to go to her dad's house. For example, because her dad is more strict, or she and her step-siblings don't get along, or her mother has negative views of her father and these influence the child. Unfortunately, most interviewers really do focus on a limited set of hypotheses, and these are generally that the child was abused and that the abuser was whom the child named as the perpetrator. However, it is in the best interest of all parties involved to understand and evaluate major plausible alternatives so that the interview can elicit the most accurate and complete information from the child. The following are the learning goals for this module. Understanding the importance of exploring the child's outcry for potentially biasing influences. Understanding the importance of assessing whether anyone has had a stake in the allegations. Understanding the importance of exploring whether parental or caregiver suggestion, intentionally or unintentionally, has occurred. Evaluating whether there are any outside sources of contamination that may have contaminated the child's statements before or after the outcry. Evaluating whether there are problematic techniques in the interview that could have contaminated the child's statements, assessing the quality of the child's memory of events, assessing the sufficiency of details provided by the child, exploring inconsistencies involved in the child's allegations, exploring logistical implausibilities, exploring fantastical details, and evaluating whether any personological factors exist that could have influenced the allegations. Let's go through these alternative hypotheses one by one. Please note that in any given child sexual abuse investigation, any one or even all of these may be potentially at play and should be explored. And further, remember that exploring does not mean believing. In fact, exploring helps you find the truth, because if one explores and finds no evidence or evidence inconsistent with the hypothesis, one can then say, I've considered that as a possibility, gathered information from the child, and have ruled it out because of what the child said in the interview. This is much better than, I didn't even consider it, I ignored that possibility, I gathered no information about that possibility, and thus I have no idea what the child would say about it. The advantage of being able to say that you've explored this is that your interview will better stand up in court if it's scrutinized in any subsequent legal proceedings, and that the multidisciplinary team is better able to support the family and child through the process with the addition of this knowledge. The purpose of this module, then, is to educate about potential alternative hypotheses for the child's statements. These were taken from a peer-reviewed article written by O'Donoghue, Benuto, and Kurluja in 2013. First, it's important to look at the circumstances around the child's outcry. By outcry, I mean the very first time the child made allegations of sexual abuse. Did the child spontaneously tell a parent that a family friend abused her? For example, a mother is taking the child to soccer practice and the child starts crying, then just blurts out that her stepfather has been touching her for the past year. Or in contrast, was the child in trouble with his parents and only told them about his teacher abusing him when he was being threatened with punishment for his or her misbehavior? This might be an attempt to deflect attention from this, or it might be a legitimate report of abuse. The point is that both of these are live possibilities that need to be investigated. None of these mean necessarily that the child was or was not abused. All we're saying is that you should try to understand under what conditions the child made his or her outcry in order to better understand the allegations. Here are some possible prompts to use when talking to the child about outcry. Tell me all about to whom you first told about the abuse. Tell me more about that. Tell me everything you can remember about the conversation. Tell me about the reactions of the people to whom you first told. Ask the child who first mentioned the alleged abuse and whether it was the child or another individual. In order to assess for repeated questions, you can ask the child how many times they were asked about the alleged abuse and what the child said each time. In the cases that the child states that another individual first brought up the alleged abuse, check for confirmative press, meaning that the child was told that other children made reports first. Ask if any rewards or threats were used, and ask about the emotional tone of the questioning. For example, that a parent was mad at them when they said no. Next comes stake. By stake, we are referring to whether anyone may have had an agenda, whether someone may gain something because of the allegations being made. For example, research has shown that children are more likely to make false allegations in the context of a custody battle. It makes sense that if two parents are fighting for custody of a child, one may have something to gain. They might get sole custody out of a sexual abuse allegation. This could be the biological father if the mother is seeing someone new and thus allegations against the mother's new boyfriend are made, or the mother has allegations against the biological father emerge. Other possibilities for stake are a child seeking emancipation from her parents, a child running away from home, revenge after a breakup, deflecting blame from inappropriate behavior by the child, such as touching another child's genitals at school, getting caught watching pornography, etc., getting in trouble for other problematic behavior, and getting a lot of attention for reporting that something happened. Once again, the point here isn't that anytime someone has a stake in the allegations made, the disclosure is automatically false. In any one of these situations, the primary reason for the disclosure may be ensuring the child's safety. Other safety-related reasons may include protecting a younger sibling. However, it is important to attend to and explore possible stake when interviewing a child. The following are questions to ask the child to assess whether he or she has had a stake or anyone else has a stake in the allegations. Tell me about what was happening when you first told about the alleged abuse. Were you in trouble in any way? Tell me about your relationship with your stepdad prior to the alleged abuse. To assess whether the child disliked the individual. Tell me about the reactions of others when you told. To assess whether the child received a lot of attention for making the allegations. Tell me about your home life at the time of the outcry. And tell me about your parents' relationship. After stake comes parental or caregiver suggestion. Parents or caregivers may question the child regarding sexual abuse even before the child has made any allegations. This usually happens in several situations. First, when parents or caregivers have heard about other children being abused, they usually want to make sure that their own children were not abused. And they may want to go to the child and begin questioning them. They might ask the child if anything happened and not take no for an answer. These kinds of questions can make the child develop a false memory about the alleged abuse, and research indicates that false information suggested by parents to their children can be incorporated into the child's memory and subsequently reported as a false allegation. Parents may also question their children before they make any sexual abuse allegations if they notice something different with the child, such as behavioral changes, a rash, and so on. Other times, the child first makes the allegation and then is questioned by the concerned parent as he or she gets more information. This questioning can also be leading. The child may only disclose touching over the clothes, but the parent really wants to make sure that no intercourse occurred, and as a result, he or she may ask suggestively about any penetration. For example, a parent might say, "Are you sure he only touched you on the outside of your underwear? Did he put his finger inside?" However, this parental suggestion could really go both ways. A child may tell her mom that her stepdad touched her, and her mother could tell her that there's no way this could have happened, and she was lying. Therefore, you want to ask the child about any interactions he or she may have had with parents or caregivers, and about the content of these interactions. Too many interviewers fail to do so. The following is a set of open-ended questions you can use to probe parental or caregiver suggestion. Tell me to whom you talked about what happened. Is there anyone else with whom you talked about what happened? Tell me everything you can remember about the talk you had with your mother, father, etc. Tell me what your mother, father, etc. said to you. How did he or she react when you told them about what happened? Tell me all about his or her reaction. It is always possible that the child could provide you with benign information. For example, a child might tell you that he came home from school and told his mother that his gym teacher had kept him after class and tried touching him. The mother could have ended the conversation right there and called the police. Related to parental caregiver suggestion is outside contamination. This refers to any interactions other than the caregiver the child may have had regarding the allegations. This could be a friend, police officer, therapist, doctor, other family members, and so on. Any one of these interactions could have contained suggestive questioning, and it is important to ask the child to whom he or she talked about the alleged abuse. It could also be that these conversations were perfectly harmless. For example, a doctor asked the child to tell him what happened in her own words. The doctor did not ask follow-up questions, but rather called Child Protective Services and let the agency handle the situation. Once again, the major take-home point is that these interactions should be explored and not just assumed to have been innocuous. The same questions used to explore parental or caregiver suggestions can also be used for outside contamination. Another hypothesis to be tested is that biasing interviewing techniques were practiced in the interview. This includes the current interview, as well as any past interviews the child may have undergone. This is because not all techniques are the same, and research has shown that practicing biasing techniques increases the likelihood that the child will produce a false memory. Additionally, CC and colleagues found that children are more likely to remember information incorrectly when biasing information was incorporated into the interviewer's questions, and further, that they were more likely to remember this information incorrectly when the source of the information was an adult rather than a peer. Interviews and the subsequent conclusions regarding status of abuse, perpetrator, etc. are much stronger if rival hypotheses, for example, that the child was threatened or bribed, or that the interviewer used leading questions, can be ruled out. We will talk about interviewing practices that you should avoid in the last module. This is because once a child's statement is contaminated, it is really hard to uncontaminate it and discern a true from false memory. Therefore, you must carefully examine the outcry, which is the possible formation of the allegation, in order to determine whether biasing pathways were present. It is important to note that just because these were present, it does not necessarily mean that they had an effect. However, being able to rule these out increases our confidence in the child's report. In the meantime, let's go back to testing alternative hypotheses. Another one to be aware of has to do with the child's memory of events. Individuals of all ages, not just children, may make memory errors when they are asked to report on abuse, which is in itself a past event. There is no research out there indicating that abuse is a special topic that people never make mistakes about when asked to recall details. Memory errors include errors of commission, that is, remembering something incorrectly, or omission, meaning leaving something out. All memory involves the error of omission as we forget. As previously mentioned, research has revealed that children are more likely to make memory errors when presented with false or misleading information. Because of this, it is really important to pay attention to how the child remembers details and whether he or she is having a difficult time remembering events. For example, if the child tells you that she thought she was dreaming and she thinks her uncle did touch her but she isn't sure, you should consider this to be a red flag. You must also be aware that certain factors beyond misleading information can affect memory. These include the child being under the influence of drugs or alcohol given by the perpetrator. Here are some guidelines for how to deal with memory issues. Pay attention to whether the narrative makes sense. Follow up on aspects of the allegations that don't make sense. For example, you said that when he raped you, 3 other individuals were in their room and they were wide awake watching TV. Can you tell me more about that? Ask about the source of the memory. For example, has the child experienced the event himself or heard about it from someone else, seen it on TV, etc. After the child provides details about each event, ask, is there anything else you can remember? Too many "I don't know" or "I don't remember" responses about core details are problematic. A core detail is a very noticeable aspect of the event. Who did it, what was done, and so on. At the end of the interview, ask the child if they told you everything they can remember or if there's something they haven't talked about yet. Somewhere related to the child's memory of events is sufficiency of details. You can analyze the narrative provided by the child regarding the allegations. For example, does it make sense? Is the child using words he wouldn't know at his age? For example, a 4-year-old using the word genitals. Of course, it is to be expected that younger children's narratives would be less detailed than those of older children and would differ in the language used. However, children of all ages should be able to report on core details, even if younger ones may have difficulties with peripheral details. Core details refer to what was actually experienced. In this case, sexual abuse, while peripheral details refer to details from the background or context, such as the setup of the room, time of the day, and so on. Research also shows that memory for core details is better than for peripheral details. That is where having the child tell you all about a memory of positive topics at the beginning of the interview comes in really handy. If the child can give you a very detailed narrative about her last birthday party, but her description of the alleged abuse is very short, you might ask yourself why that is. The following are guidelines for assessing whether the child is providing an appropriate level of details. Use the free narrative about a positive topic at the beginning of the interview to gauge the child's vocabulary and level of detail. Practice this narrative with a high level of detail and ask for sights, sounds, feelings, etc. Determine whether the child is able to give you information about core details. You care about these more than about peripheral details. And pay attention to age-appropriate word use. For example, if a 5-year-old girl uses the word genitals, ask about how she knows this word. Next come inconsistent details or statements. Children can be inconsistent within the same interview, for example, first saying that they were touched 5 times and later saying that they were touched 10 times, or across statements, such as a statement given to the mother then to the interviewer. Children are sometimes interviewed more than once and talk to various people, including parents, friends, police officers, social workers, and others. If the child's statement involves details that change from person to person, it is important to try to find out why that's happening. Research indicates that children reporting true events are more likely to repeat the same core details across interviews than those reporting on false events. Research also shows that narratives about false events tend to become longer and incorporate more exaggerated, aggressive, and fantastical details. Additionally, these are more vague and have fewer core details and more contradictions. It could be that a child forgot to mention a detail to the deputy who first took the statement and remembered a detail in the forensic interview. For example, the child mentioned only being touched in the house, but later also talked about being touched in the truck. Nevertheless, you can easily ask the child about the inconsistency because, by definition, 2 inconsistent statements cannot both be true. One way you might do this is by asking the child, "You previously mentioned that you were only touched in the house, but you just told me about a truck incident too. I'd like to better understand what happened. Can you tell me more about where you were touched?" The idea here is that inconsistent details should not be ignored or swept under the rug, as they often are in forensic interviews. You're not asking this in a confrontational manner, but rather in a gentle manner, trying to prompt the child to further explain this inconsistency. Plausible reasons could be that the child didn't feel comfortable, might have indicated that they forgot, and so on. Another type of statement made by the child that should be a red flag is a logistical implausibility. Logistical implausibilities refer to details about the allegations that may not have happened because they appear to be quite improbable given the specific circumstances. Here are some examples of logistical improbabilities or implausibilities from actual investigations of child sexual abuse. Claims that the child experienced anal penetration and this tickled. Claims that the child was sexually abused while on a parent's lap with other family members in the room, none of which have witnessed anything. Claims that the child did not remember about the abuse until he or she had a dream about it. Claims that there was penile vaginal penetration, but the child's pants were on the entire time. And claims that a green substance or any other colorful color came out of the perpetrator's penis. In the case of improbable statements about sexual acts, you should first attempt to gently direct the child's attention to these and see if they have anything else to say. Then explore hypotheses that may better account for the child's statement. For example, this could be that the child read or watched something on TV or was coached by someone into making the allegations. A more extreme type of implausible detail is the fantastical detail. Fantastical details are elements that are impossible, which is flying around the room, people murdered, when no murders are reported, etc. Although not a particularly common occurrence, fantastical details such as disclosure of anal penetration with a sharp object such as a knife and lack of evidence of any cuts or wounds from the medical examination should signal to you that at least that specific portion of the child's statement was made up. Research has shown that narratives about fabricated events are more likely to contain such details than those about true events. If you're thinking that children would never incorporate such details into their allegations, think again. Remember that these types of details first received attention during the daycare trial when children alleged all sorts of outlandish things, including that they saw witches flying around. The last hypothesis that is important for you to explore is that something in the child's history may influence his or her ability to tell the truth. This could be mental health problems, such as a conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. One of the criteria for CD is deceitfulness or theft, and a child with CD may often lie to obtain goods or favors or to avoid obligations, for example by conning others. Children with ODD may be vindictive or spiteful and often defy authority figures and blame others for their mistakes. The child may also have developmental disabilities that makes him or her more suggestible. As we saw in the module on child development, children with developmental disabilities are more suggestible than peers with normal growth and development. Children with disabilities are also up to 5 times more likely to be abused, and not just sexually. Those with developmental speech and language delays are at some of the highest risk for abuse. On the other hand, extremely shy or withdrawn children may have a hard time disclosing their abuse. Children who are homophobic may have a hard time disclosing same-gender abuse. Lastly, children may have a history of telling lies. It would definitely be important to know whether the child has made physical or sexual abuse allegations in the past, and these were determined to be unfounded. Individuals who know the child, for example parents, teachers, and doctors, could help you figure out if there are any personological details present. Once again, the presence of any of these does not definitively indicate that the allegations are false. However, they are all red flags and should be investigated as they may influence the child's truth-telling or ability to just disclose on allegations. Now let's go over some guidelines for addressing possible personological details. Interview collateral sources, teacher, parents, doctors, about any problematic behavior and diagnoses. Try to get medical records for any developmental disability or mental health diagnosis. Try to get school records that report on any accommodations the child requires, as well as the child's behavior. Remember that your job is not to diagnose, but rather be aware that there are psychological factors that could interfere with the child's behavior and statements. Pay attention to the child's behavior. Is it unusual in some way? Does the child have a short attention span and get distracted easily? In the case of children with ADHD or disabilities that it will influence attention span, reduce the length of the interview. In the cases of children with developmental disabilities, use simpler language that matches their developmental level. Consult with a professional if needed. If the child has a diagnosis, like depression, and you don't know how this might interfere with the interview. Do not make assumptions about the child's behavior during the interview. For example, if the child appears to be avoidant, this could be the result of the child having PTSD, possible depression, ADHD, and the avoidance is because the child is distracted, or the child might not be comfortable talking about certain topics, or that nothing happened to the child for him or her to report on. And lastly, recognize when a child is beyond your expertise. For example, when dealing with a child who doesn't speak English, who has severe mental illness that is not controlled, and others. The goal of this module has been to highlight relevant alternative hypotheses that you, the interviewer, should explore. Systematically ruling these in or out will strengthen the conclusions that you can make about whether sexual abuse has in fact occurred. Here are some guidelines for assessing alternative hypotheses. Do explore the child's outcry. When doing so, ask the child about to whom they first told, what their circumstances around this were, and what the reactions to the outcry were. Do assess whether SAKE was present in the allegations. Do evaluate whether any parents or caregivers have interacted with the child in a suggestive manner. Ask the child who all he or she talked to about the allegations, what the child said to them, what they said to the child, and how they reacted. Do evaluate whether there are any other individuals who talked to the child using the same questions as guideline number 3. When the child has a difficult time remembering details, do assess why this is. Do assess whether the child's mental state was altered by alcohol or some other substance that could affect memory. Do assess whether the child's narrative is sufficient. Does it have a beginning, middle, end? Does it make sense? Does it include the child's reactions to the abuse? Do consider age differences in communication and that younger children's narratives may be less detailed. If the child makes inconsistent statements, do not just ignore them. Do ask the child about these inconsistencies. If you're aware of the child's statements from before the interview and the child's report is currently different, do explore these inconsistencies as well. If the child makes implausible statements, once again, do not just ignore these. Ask the child to explain the statement and inform the child that you're just trying to understand better what he or she experienced. If the child makes fantastical details, do explore these as well. And know that fantastical details by definition render at least that part of the child's statement false. Do use information from collateral sources, meaning teachers, parents, doctors, etc., to assess whether personological details are present, and do consult with professionals when faced with potential personological factors with which you are not familiar. Having addressed alternative hypotheses that you should explore in a forensic interview, let's move on to another important consideration: cultural competence. Module 5. We live in a country that is increasingly multicultural. That means that as interviewers, we are very likely to come into contact with children whose culture is different from ours. Therefore, this module will focus on how to attend to cultural factors when conducting forensic interviews. We will discuss the following learning principles: understanding what culture is, exploring implications of culture for a child's memory of events, understanding how social expectations might influence a child's report, understanding how gender may influence the child's report, addressing language barriers, considering consultation with another professional, and understanding that sometimes you're better off not conducting the interviewer. So what is culture anyway? Culture is generally thought to be a pattern of values and learned behaviors that are transmitted through generations. However, it is important to know that culture has many definitions and is in fact something that is debated by sociologists and anthropologists to this day. Complicating this is the fact that there are so many potential cultural factors to attend to when interviewing children who may have been sexually abused. These include age, gender, abilities, language, socioeconomic status, sex, ethnicity, disabilities, life experiences, and more. With all these different factors to attend to, how can you truly become culturally competent when you are doing a forensic interview? Unfortunately, there really isn't any research specific to forensic interviewing culture or evidence-based recommendations for how to become culturally competent. At most, some forensic interviewing protocols recommend that you attend to cultural factors rather than ignore these, but this is not sufficient nor particularly prescriptive, in that it does not tell us what to do. A first step towards becoming culturally competent is to consider and respect the diversity of each individual child interviewed. This means recognizing any biases that you may have. Having a cultural bias essentially means that you believe that your culture and its customs are normal, while anything outside of it is not. For example, the child of an immigrant parent might have been taught that they only wash dirty laundry at home, meaning that problems are kept in the family. This may make the child reluctant to talk about abuse to a stranger. However, when you rub up against this in the interview, instead of asking the child about his level of comfort in discussing family issues and what others have told him to say, and informing the child that your role is to talk to children about difficult things, you get frustrated and accuse the child of not cooperating. A second step towards becoming culturally competent is to avoid making assumptions or drawing conclusions based on your personal beliefs. An example of a problematic assumption would be assuming that because the child is a fourth-generation Hispanic American, his language of choice is English. It could be that while the child does speak English at school, at home the family only speaks Spanish, and thus the child is more comfortable using Spanish. Remember to treat each child as an individual. Do not assume that you know the child's preferred language. Ask the child how comfortable she or he feels talking about body parts and other potentially embarrassing topics. Ask if other individuals have told the child not to talk to the interviewer because problems are kept in the family. A third step is to be familiar with some of the research on culture and principles relevant to child sexual abuse interviewing, given that we're missing research directly linking culture to forensic interviewing. While each and every factor mentioned above will not be addressed, a few ways in which culture may affect the forensic interview with a child will be highlighted. Research has shown that culture informs how we attend to our environment. This is important because the memories that you retrieve depend on how you attend to features of information during the encoding of memories. Encoding simply means how we process information from the environment. For example, East Asians have been found to attend to contextual information, particularly the background in complex scenes, while Americans attend to object-based information, meaning details about the focal point in a picture or scene. This is similar to our prior discussion about core versus peripheral details. It may be that the case then that at least immigrant East Asian children, if not a few generations after that, would also attend to contextual information over object-based information. The child's culture could affect the ease with which he or she describes what happened to him or her versus the setting in which the alleged abuse occurred. Thus, culture is clearly important for how we remember things and also about how we talk about them. Asking the child questions that focus on recent events, like a birthday party, will help you determine if the child can in fact answer questions and talk about past events. Some cultures, called collectivistic, place the focus on the group, while others, called individualistic, focus on the individual. As a result, children from collectivistic cultures, such as East Asia, Central and South America, are less inclined to talk about themselves. This goes hand in hand with social expectations, which can also vary from culture to culture. Children of certain cultures, such as Latino ones, are less likely to disclose or discuss abuse to an interviewer because such experiences are not to be discussed with authorities, but rather be kept in the family. Some cultures, for example Muslim ones, are much less likely to openly talk about body parts, sex, and related topics. Although you cannot change the social expectations of the child's culture, one thing you could do is inform the child that although in many situations adults don't want children to speak a lot or discuss certain topics, in this case you really need to hear what they have to say, however embarrassing this may be. Gender differences have been found in regards to disclosure, with males being less likely to disclose due to fears of being labeled a homosexual, being perceived as weak or a victim, etc. Gender may also be relevant to the interview itself. Whenever possible, you want to ensure that the gender of the child matches that of the interviewer. You can imagine how difficult it would be for a girl to talk to a male interviewer, especially if the abuse was perpetrated by a male. A really important issue that hasn't been addressed yet is that of language and interpreters. You need to first determine what the child's preferred language is and not make assumptions. Next, you should be prepared to have an interpreter on hand. However, this comes with a bit of a warning. Some interpreters are highly trained and intuitive and can interpret not just the words themselves, but the overall message with the right tone and mood, while some completely lack this skill and require constant correcting. It is not sufficient for an interpreter to just translate or interpret verbatim what you're saying. For example, the next module will instruct you on how to build rapport with a child. When you're asking the child questions about a positive event, it is important not just what you ask, but also how you ask it. You want to be warm and empathetic so that the child becomes comfortable with you. This may get lost in translation or the interpreting process and could affect your ability to establish rapport with the child. Interpreters may also be required in interviews with children who are deaf. Family members or friends cannot be used as interpreters. This could make the child very uncomfortable, especially if that individual does not know what the child has gone through. It could be even more problematic if there's no knowledge of who the perpetrator is and he or she were to be used as a translator. Another issue to consider when interviewing a child from a cultural or ethnic background different from your own is the possible need to consult with a specialist from the background about ethnic or cultural factors that could possibly impact the interview process. This should always be an option, and seeking consultation is a sign of strength rather than weakness when approaching the forensic interview process from a culturally competent perspective. Lastly, you may find yourself in situations in which your expertise is simply not sufficient given the case at hand. For example, you're about to interview a child who speaks Samoan and no such interpreters are available. In these situations, it is okay to bow out and reschedule the interview with another interviewer who may be better qualified. Below is a set of guidelines for how to consider culture when conducting forensic interviews. Do treat each child as an individual. Do not make assumptions about what cultural factors will influence the interview at hand. Do ask if you're unsure about cultural factors that are relevant. For example, what a child's preferred language is, if the child speaks both English and another language at home. To consider that how a child talks about alleged abuse may be influenced by culture. For example, whether he attends to what happened to himself versus describing the circumstances. Do be aware that a child's reluctance to talk about abuse may be due to different cultural expectations rather than because the child is being avoidant due to the allegations being false. Do inform the child that although in many situations adults don't want children to speak a lot or to discuss certain topics, in this case you really need to hear what they have to say, however embarrassing this may be. Do match the gender of the child with that of the interviewer. Do have an interpreter available in case of children who speak a different language or who are deaf. Do not use members or friends as interpreters. Do consider consultation with another professional if you're unsure about how to deal with certain cultural factors. And do consider not conducting the interview if faced with a case completely outside of your expertise. Having gone over some of the most important concepts to be familiar with for forensic interviewing, let's move on to the interview itself. We'll begin with setting the stage for the interview. Module 6. The goal for this module is to teach you how to set the stage in the interview. By setting the stage, we mean that you want to introduce yourself to the child, familiarize the child with the interview process, and go over the rules for the forensic interview. We will first go over the learning objectives. Most of these are guidelines, and there may be at times when exceptions are made. For example, we want to always interview the child alone, but sometimes for good practical reasons, there may need to be someone else in the room like an interpreter. Introducing yourself and the interview process to the child, building rapport with the child, teaching the child that it is okay to use I don't know responses, teaching the child to say when they don't remember the answer to a question or they're not comfortable answering a question, establishing that the child understands the difference between the truth and a lie, which is especially important for younger children, establishing the special importance of the truth in the interview, inquiring about why the child thinks he or she is being interviewed, assessing whether the child was threatened or bribed before the interview, assessing whether the child is uncomfortable discussing certain topics, and assessing whether the child is attempting to please an authority figure. These set the stage for the interview because we address the issues first, so that when we ask the open-ended question, "Is there anything you want to tell me about what happened to you?" we are pretty clear that the child is ready to answer this. They know the rules of the interview, so to speak. But first, let's go over some rules for you, the interviewer. First, you only want to interview one child at a time. Sometimes multiple children in the family are brought in for interviews, but you want to separate the children. You might want to interview the child that you think is easiest or most forthcoming first, in order to learn the most. You might learn things that you want to follow up with the other children. You also want to interview the children alone, without the parents in the room. Having others in the room, such as siblings and parents, can make the child feel very uncomfortable, and so that they cannot answer freely. Also, a major goal of the interview is to get the child's version of the events, and you want to minimize the likelihood that others will contaminate the statements of the children. The interviewing room should be relatively free of distractions. This means limited decorations, toys, and other things that might distract the child while you're asking questions. There's a balance here. You don't want it so boring that the child wants to leave, but not so interesting that they don't pay attention to you. And lastly, interviews should be videotaped in a way that captures both you and the child. Let's move on to general principles about how to initially interact with a child in a forensic interview. Use developmentally appropriate language. Child development was explored in Module 1. Talk in a smooth, soothing, slow tone because the child needs to follow you and like the tone of your voice. Keep sentences short, such as "tell me about your family" and "what else can you remember?" Make sure that the child is paying attention. Ask the child if he or she needs a break at various increments in the interview, for example, to use the bathroom or get a snack. Don't move on to the next task until you're really clear that the current task is understood by the child. For example, don't move to "I don't know your responses are okay" until the prior step of establishing rapport has been clearly accomplished. Maintain eye contact and make sure the child is also making eye contact because the child may look away when talking about embarrassing things. Smile and be positive and reassuring. Validate the child's experience. For example, you want to communicate to the child that you know they've never done this before and therefore it might be new and unusual for them. Let the child know that your job is to talk to kids and that you've talked to kids about all sorts of things. Ask the child if he or she has any questions for you before you start. You can also give the child time markers like "we're almost through," or give the child reinforcement. We don't want to reinforce one kind of answers, but overall talking by the child. So at various times you could say something like, "You're doing a great job answering my questions." Having reviewed the rules for the interviewer, let's go through the steps of setting the stage for the interview. First, we're going to talk about how to properly introduce the interviewer and interview process. Children who may have been sexually abused come into a forensic interview knowing very little about the interview process. Because of this, it is up to you, the interviewer, to make the child feel comfortable before you get into any questions about possible abuse. When the child first comes to the interviewing room, it is a good idea to introduce yourself and what you do. You also want to explain the various items found in the room, such as any cameras and recording equipment. Here's an example. Hi, my name is Olga and my job is to talk to children. What's your name? My name is Sally. Hi Sally, it's nice to meet you. I want you to look around the room and tell me what you see. There's a camera. That's right. There's a camera that records everything you and I do in here. And here's the microphone. It is now a good time to focus on building rapport with the child. Rapport means developing trust, understanding, respect, and liking between two persons. Essentially, your goal is to build trust with the child and have the child comfortable with you so that he or she can later tell you about potentially difficult topics. A good interview always begins by building rapport, and you can do this by asking the child open-ended questions about positive topics such as the child's friends, family, hobbies, schools, and any other activities you can think of. By open-ended questions, I mean that you want to ask the child to tell you all about a certain topic. We are doing this to get the child used to responding in a narrative to an open-ended question. We will explore open-ended versus other types of questions more thoroughly in a later module. Here's a rapport building conversation might play out. Sally, what are some things you do for fun? I like swimming and playing with my friends. Wow, that sounds really fun. I like to swim too. Tell me all about swimming. My mom takes me to the YMCA to go swimming. Tell me more about the last time you went swimming. Start from the beginning, go through the end, and don't leave out any details. You might do this for approximately 10 minutes. Don't cut rapport short. You are building a reserve of good that will need to potentially get you through some future tough spots in the interview. We have reviewed a lot of forensic interviews, and a common mistake is to rush through this, or not even do it at all. Interviewers will get 1 or 2 positive responses from a child, then wham, go on to the tough stuff. The goal of this part of the interview is to make the child more comfortable with you and with the process of answering questions. We also want the child to learn to give very detailed narratives as opposed to one-word responses. It is a good idea to go through several of these positive and fun topics until the child appears to be comfortable with you. Signs of this are the child making eye contact, smiling at you, having an open posture, talking to you at ease, and giving detailed answers. Signs that the child is not comfortable include the child is looking down or away, answering I don't know repeatedly, being non-responsive, saying repeatedly that he or she wants a break or to stop the interview, and constantly giving you short or one-word answers, and having a defensive body posture, including having the arms crossed. There are no absolute guidelines for exactly how long the rapport building phase should last, although it is a good idea to note the child's developmental level. Generally, about 10 to 15 minutes of rapport building is sufficient and gets the child comfortable enough to be able to move on to the other steps of the interview. You can always go back to asking rapport building questions later in the interview if you notice the child starting to become non-responsive, which is a sign of the child being uncomfortable. If you're having trouble establishing rapport with a child, try asking the child more about positive activities. Some children never end up feeling comfortable with the interviewer, and in that case, you need to decide whether to move on to the other steps or terminate the interview. You also want to consider whether having someone else interview the child might be a better option. Also remember that this is not your fault. Some children are just harder to establish rapport with, but with most it can be done in approximately 10 to 15 minutes. After you have established rapport with the child, it is important to discuss I don't know responses. By I don't know responses, I mean that you must let the child know that it is perfectly okay to answer a question with I don't know if they don't actually know the answer, and that you don't want them to guess. Remember that in many settings like school, children are told that I don't know responses are bad. Failing to straighten this out might indicate to the child that you expect an answer to every question, just like the teacher would, and they better give you one, even if that means they have to guess. This is the opposite of what we want to happen in an interview. However, it is not sufficient to just let the child that they can answer, "I don't know." It is preferable to also practice this with the child. Children can nod and seem agreeable, but may not really understand or know how to implement what you just told them. You can ask the child 2 questions to which they definitely would not know the answer. A commonly used question is, "What is the name of my dog?" Presumably, the child has never met you or your dog and wouldn't know the answer to this question. Another common question is, "How many phalanges do you have?" Phalanges is another word for fingers. Let's see how this might play out. "Sally, I want us to talk about some of the rules we have in here. One rule is that if you don't know the answer to one of my questions, it is perfectly okay to say I don't know. I don't want you to guess or make up an answer. So let's practice this. If I asked you, what is the name of my dog? What would you say?" "I don't know." "That's right, great job. You've never met my dog, so you don't know his name." If the child answers anything other than "I don't know," you want to provide corrective feedback and try again. Let's look at an example. "Sally, if I asked you, what is the name of my dog, what would you say?" "Buddy." "That's not quite right. You've never met my dog, so you don't know his name. Let's try again. If I asked you, what is my dog's name, what would you say?" Other questions you can ask the child include, "What did I have for breakfast today? How many children do I have? And what is my mother's name?" You also want to talk to the child about related responses such as answering, "I don't remember," or "I don't feel comfortable talking about that." Children sometimes use "I don't know" as a catch-all phrase when they just don't want to answer a question, either because they don't remember a detail or they don't feel comfortable providing an answer. This is how you might phrase this. Let's say I ask you a question you don't want to answer. For example, have you ever snuck out and ate candy when someone told you that you couldn't? If you didn't want to tell me the real answer to this, what would you say? "I don't want to tell you." Or, "I don't feel comfortable answering that." Great job! I'd rather hear that you don't want to answer when you don't than hear some other answer from you. Another step is establishing that the child understands the difference between the truth and a lie. Obviously, this is more important for young children, say below the age of 6, than older ones, like 15-year-olds. After you have taught the child to answer "I don't know," instead of guessing, and "I don't want to answer that," you can move on to truth and lie discussions. You can ask the child to tell you what the truth is or what a lie is, and to test the specific knowledge of truth versus lies. A common way this is done in forensic interviewing is by asking the child about something in the room. For example, let's say that the child is sitting in a blue chair. If I said you were sitting in a red chair, would that be the truth or a lie? It's a lie. Why? Because the chair is red. Now let's say the child is wearing green pants. If I said you had on green pants, would that be the truth or a lie? It's the truth. Why? Because my pants are green. If the child gets these questions wrong, you want to provide feedback and try again. For example, let's say that the child is wearing green pants. If I said you had on green pants, would that be the truth or a lie, and why? It's a lie. Really? What color are your pants? Green. Your pants are green. So would it be a truth or a lie if I said they were green? It would be the truth. Once you've figured out that the child knows the difference between truth and lies, you want to get a sense of how important they actually think telling the truth is in this situation. Although telling the truth is generally seen as important and preferred to lying, there are certain situations, like when playing pretend games, where people may consider it acceptable to not talk about true things, or when telling a white lie to spare someone's feelings. It is key that the child understands that it is important to only talk about true things during the interview, meaning things that really have happened. For example, you could ask the child, "Do you think it's important to tell me the truth today?" "Yeah." "Tell me why it's important to tell the truth today." "It's important to tell the truth because I'm only supposed to talk about things that really happened and not make things up." "That's right. And the main rule today is to only tell the truth and nothing but the truth. It's really important to do that. Additionally, it is considered good practice and more likely to increase truth-telling if after the truth-lie discussion you ask the child if they promise to tell the truth. You may ask, "Do you promise to only tell the truth?" If the child says no, and this has happened before in real interviews, you want to ask why. It could be that the child wasn't paying attention to your question, was just playing around, or that he or she doesn't feel comfortable talking to you about what happened. In this case, you could remind the child that your job is to talk to a lot of children and to tell you when they don't feel comfortable. Either way, you want to make sure that the child expresses that telling the truth is important and promises to only tell the truth. After engaging in a truth-lie discussion and having the child promise to tell the truth, you want to address with the child why he or she is being interviewed today. You can do this by asking, "So tell me, Johnny, why do you think you're here today?" It is important to do this because sometimes children have inaccurate ideas about the purpose of the interview and their role in the interview. Sometimes their ideas are just off base. One child said the reason they were there was to talk loud. Sometimes they feel that the reason they're there is because they're in trouble. For example, the child may think that his role is to put someone in jail or to protect someone. The child may also think that he or she is there to talk about what they already told someone else, like their parents or a patrol officer who took his initial statement. It is also important to communicate to the child that you're here to ask questions and they're there to answer them, and that you don't know the answer to the questions because you were never there. You want to ask the child what others have told him about the interview. To do this, you could ask, "Has anyone told you anything about coming in today?" "My mom." "Tell me about what your mom said to you." "She said I had to tell you guys everything and to only tell the truth." This example shows that the child may have received benign information from others. In general, you want to hear that either no one told the child anything about being interviewed or that someone told him or her something harmless. In some cases, the child will tell you that someone told the child not to talk about anything, or that they were told to say that something happened when it really didn't. We'll explore threats and bribes more next. Let's say that the child is non-responsive, shrugs his or her shoulders, or says, "I don't know." "Has anyone told you anything about coming in today?" "My mom." "Tell me about what your mom said to you." "I don't know." "Can you give me any idea why you may have been brought here to talk to me?" If the child continues to be non-responsive, you can ask him or her why his parents or caregivers brought him in, and that you heard that someone was concerned about the child. The more detailed you get with the questions, meaning that you start asking questions about what they told, any bruises on their body, that you heard that something happened to them that wasn't okay, the more suggestibility you might introduce, and this is something you want to avoid. If you're still not getting an answer from the child, it might be a good idea to reevaluate whether to continue the interview. Remember, these are interviews with children who may have been sexually abused. This indicates that there is a possibility that the child was not abused and has nothing to tell you. You might also reassure the child that he or she is not here because he is in trouble. Sometimes children are threatened or bribed by others into either not talking about the sexual abuse they experienced or talking about something that never happened to them. Children may be threatened by their abuser or someone who doesn't want to see the abuser convicted. For example, they may be told that if they tell someone about the abuse, they, their family members, friends, or pets will be harmed in some way. An abuser might say, "If you tell mommy, I will make sure you never see her and your family again." Conversely, children may be bribed either with objects, trips, attention, and so on to say or not say something that happened. For example, a parent might say, "If you tell the police that daddy abused you, I will get custody of you and you'll get to see me all the time and I'll take you to Disneyland." Sometimes threats and bribes are not done maliciously, such as in the case of an aunt who found her niece sharing a bed with a family friend. The niece would not tell her what transpired, and as a result, the aunt threatened her to take her down to the police station for a polygraph that would determine what happened to her. This aunt may have had good intentions in wanting to find out if any harm had been done to her niece. However, the way she went about it may now pose problems in the investigation. We saw in the previous module on suggestibility how pressures like this can affect a child's memory of events and accuracy of details. Nevertheless, it is important that you ask questions about whom the child spoke and what these individuals said to the child, because the conversations might interfere with the child's ability to disclose certain information. For example, has anyone told you not to answer my questions truthfully? Or, has anyone promised you something to come in here and talk to me? Yes. Tell me all about that. If the child becomes non-responsive, you can ask what he or she thinks will happen if he or she answers your questions. For example, has anyone told you not to answer my questions? Or, has anyone promised you something to come in here and talk to me? What do you think might happen if you are to answer my questions? If the child discloses that someone threatened him or her, you do not want to make any promises that you might not be able to keep, such as that you'll be able to keep the child safe or nothing else will come to them. Instead, you want to relay this information to your team. Another crime may have been committed, and law enforcement may need to form a plan to protect the child. Another thing that may affect the child's willingness to disclose certain information is whether they feel comfortable to discuss certain topics. Having to talk about potential child sexual abuse includes talking about very specific acts and body parts, and many children are not comfortable discussing this. We generally see this in forensic interviewing when the child becomes non-responsive, starts pointing to places on the body and refuses to say the actual words, says, "I don't know," repeatedly, and so on. Asking the child if he or she is comfortable answering questions when difficult topics come up or when the child's affect changes may inform the interviewer as to what he or she could do to make the child more comfortable in order to prevent the child from minimizing his or her responses due to fears about the subject matter. As mentioned earlier, it is also better to remind a child that they can let you know if they don't feel comfortable talking about something, rather than answering with "I don't know." It may also be reassuring to the child if you let them know, "I've heard everything. There's nothing you can tell me that I haven't heard before." Lastly, after addressing whether the child doesn't feel like they can answer truthfully because of what others told him or her, or because they don't feel comfortable, it is also important to assess whether the child is answering in a way that is trying to please you, the interviewer, instead of disagreeing with you. You can do this by asking the child to correct you if you make a mistake, and then practicing this. "Sally, sometimes I make mistakes. If I get confused and say something wrong, I want you to correct me. So if I said you were 20 years old, what would you say?" "I'm 10. You want the child to correct you rather than go along with this mistake. You also want the child to let you know when he or she doesn't understand something you've asked. For example, "Sally, sometimes I might use words that you don't understand. If you don't understand something I say, I want you to let me know and I will say it in another way." Let's practice this. "Sally, how many phalanges do you have?" "What are phalanges?" Good job. Phalanges is another way to say fingers. Let me ask this another way. How many fingers do you have? 10. Other questions you can ask children are, what gender are you? How many siblings do you have? And do you have a feline? Let's summarize the principles we just explored. When talking to children, do use developmentally appropriate language. Do talk in a smooth, soothing, slow tone. Do keep sentences short. Do make sure that the child is paying attention. Do ask the child if he or she needs a break. And do not move on to the next task until you are really clear that the current task is understood by the child. Do maintain eye contact and make sure that the child is also making eye contact. Do smile and be positive and reassuring. Do validate the child's experience. Do let the child know that your job is to talk to kids and you've talked to kids about all sorts of things. Do ask the child if he or she has any questions for you before you start. When beginning the interview process, Do introduce yourself and the interview process to the child. Do first build rapport with the child. Do teach the child I don't know responses and practice these. Do teach the child to say when they don't remember an answer to a question or they're not comfortable answering a question and practice this. Do establish that the child understands the difference between the truth and a lie. Do establish the special importance of the truth in an interview. Do inquire about why the child thinks he or she is being interviewed. Do assess whether the child was threatened or bribed. Do assess whether the child is uncomfortable talking about certain topics. And do assess whether the child is attempting to please an authority figure. Having talked about how to set the stage for the interview before any abuse-related questions are asked, let's move on to interview mistakes that you should avoid. Module 7. After you set the stage for the interview, the next part of the interview is used to ask various questions to get more information about what happened, if anything at all. After all, the forensic interview is an information gathering process. It is at this stage that what you do and the questions you ask may introduce suggestibility and elicit answers from the child that may not be accurate. Thus, this module will address potentially biasing techniques that you should avoid when interviewing children who may have been abused. The following are our learning objectives: exploring question types and which to use versus to avoid, understanding leading questions and why these should be avoided, understanding repetitive questions and why these should be avoided, exploring the effects of disconfirmation on the child's responses and why you should avoid doing this, exploring the effects of conformity press on the child's responses and why you should avoid using this, understanding how guessing and speculating can contaminate the child's answers and why you should avoid this, and exploring basic learning principles and why you should avoid differentially reinforcing responses. First, it is important to avoid using inappropriate question types. Question types were briefly introduced in the module on child development and range from open-ended to closed-ended, directive to free recall. Question types that you should avoid relying on as much as possible, especially initially, are those that are closed-ended. These include yes, no, who, what, where, when, why, and multiple choice. By the way, the word prompt is just another way to say question, and I will use the two words interchangeably throughout the rest of the module. Here are some examples of closed-ended prompts. Did he also touch your bottom? Who touched your weeby? When did this happen? What did he do with his hands? Where were you in the house? Why do you think he did that? Did he touch you on the inside of your private or outside of your private? And here are examples of open-ended prompts. Tell me all about that. Can you tell me more about that? And then what happened? What else happened? What happened next? Is there anything else you can remember? Do you see the difference between the two types of prompts? The goal isn't to completely stay away from closed-ended questions. Rather, it is important to first exhaust open-ended prompts and only then go to the closed-ended ones. Additionally, first use an open-ended prompt, like, do you remember anything else about that? And then go to a closed-ended prompt to get more detail about something the child has already mentioned. For example, how many times did that happen? Do not use closed-ended prompts to suggest or introduce new information to the child. The problem with closed-ended prompts is that they can make it seem as though only specific responses are wanted or reasonable. Additionally, research shows that these are less accurate. Research has shown that open-ended questions are the best and that they're not leading and will get the most accurate information from the child. This is how an open-ended question might be asked. Let's say that you ask the child why he is being interviewed, and he tells you that it has to do with what his stepfather did to him. My stepdad did something really bad. Tell me all about what he did. Well, he came into my room and hurt me. Can you tell me more about that? He touched my penis and put his finger in my butt. Tell me all about that from beginning to end and don't leave out any details. He came into my room and closed the door. And then what happened? When the child mentions the detail that you want to find out more about, or leaves something out, you can continue to use open-ended prompts. For example, a child may have told you that his stepdad took his pants off. What the child was wearing during the alleged abuse could be important in an investigation if the police decides to get a warrant for these articles of clothing to examine for possible DNA, and you decide that it's important to get more information about the clothing. Instead of asking, "What were you wearing? PJs or shorts?" you could ask the child, "Tell me everything you remember about the clothing you were wearing." "I had green shorts and blue shirt." "Can you remember anything else about the clothing?" Ask these until the child says no. Interviewers often start out with the "tell me all about" prompt, but quickly revert to using directive questions. Let's take a look how that might play out when the interviewer wants to find out more about what the stepdad did to the child's bottom. "My stepdad did something really bad." "Can you tell me more about that?" "Well, he came into my room and he hurt me." "How did he hurt you?" "He touched my penis and my butt." "How did he touch your butt? Did he use his fingers? Did he put them inside or outside?" Instead, the interviewer could have asked, "He touched my penis and my butt. Tell me all about that." "Well, he put his hand on my penis and went up and down." "And then what happened?" "Then he put his hand on my butt." "Tell me all about that." "He rubbed my butt and then he put his finger inside." "Can you remember anything else?" Here's a good rule. Always ask an open-ended prompt. Always go back to open-ended prompts. Open-ended prompts are never a mistake. Only and only if these are not working for the subject, go to closed-ended prompts. Do not forget to go back to using open-ended prompts when the child introduces another abuse event or brings up another topic. Some recommend a funnel approach to interviewing, in which open-ended questions are asked first to elicit free narratives from the child, and in which closed-ended questions are used sparingly to clarify content. This is because closed-ended questions limit the options of responses available to the child, and the child may feel that he or she can only answer from the options provided. Thus, it is considered best practice to first exhaust open-ended prompts and then go on to closed-ended ones for more details. Another type of question to avoid entirely is the leading question. Leading questions occur when the interviewer introduces information instead of the child. Here are 2 examples and why these should be avoided. "Tell me what you told the officer about your uncle." This would be problematic if the child has not mentioned anything about her uncle. It is better to say, "Is there anything you would like to let me know?" and wait for the child to mention the uncle first. And 2, "Where did it hurt when she helped you take a bath?" This would be problematic if the child has not mentioned any pain, even if she mentioned having taken a bath. The bath could have been a benign activity, but introducing the idea that the child was hurt during this process could lead to the formation of false memories. By the way, this example came from an actual forensic case. There is a very large body of research that shows just how suggestive these can be in an interview because they may suggest to the child what the desired response is. Study after study has shown that these types of questions are more likely to produce inaccurate information. In addition to leading questions, you should also try to avoid repetitive questions or asking the child the same question, even when slightly differently worded, more than once. This is because children learning histories generally make it so that if they're asked the same question more than once, they think it was because their first answer was not correct. Thus, there is pressure to change the first answer, even if that answer is true. Think about children's experience in school. If the teachers ask Timmy, "What is 2 plus 2?" and Timmy says 5, the teacher may ask the question again, indicating that Timmy's answer was wrong. The last thing you want to do is have the child change his or her answer because you are asking something more than one time. Remember that asking the question twice can be disconfirming to the child's prior answer. Also recall that you told the child earlier that it's okay to say "I don't know" or "I don't remember." Do not disconfirm this. Let's look at an example. My babysitter touched my private part. Did she touch you on the inside or outside? Outside? Are you sure it was only on the outside? Yeah, she only touched me on the outside. What about inside? She didn't touch you there at all? In some cases, the type of repeated questions above can result in the child eventually agreeing that the babysitter also touched her on the inside. These questions have been shown to have higher rates of eliciting incorrect information. There are some cases when you might have to ask a question twice. For example, if you got confused or forgot the child's answer. It would then be prudent to tell the child in the beginning of the interview or at that time that if you ask a question more than once, it is not because you want a different answer, but rather than because you forgot that you already asked the question or you forgot the answer. Having discussed the types of questions you should avoid, let's go over some other bad interviewing practices. Disconfirming the child's responses is one of them. Essentially, this means challenging the child's answers, which communicates to the child that what he or she said wasn't the correct or desired response. Children sometimes respond to this by changing their answers, and if a child accepts that he or she has actually made a mistake, he or she may reevaluate their recall and make changes to match your statement. Here are some examples. Example 1 comes from an actual child sexual abuse interview. Tell me why you're here today. I don't know. Why did your mom bring you to see me? I don't know. Are you sure you don't know? I don't think that's true. This is problematic because the interviewer is not accepting the child's I don't know answer. It could be that the child genuinely didn't know why she was there, that nothing happened to her, or that she didn't feel comfortable talking about a certain topic. And here is example 2, also taken from a real interview. I talked to my mom about the abuse and she said, "It's okay, you don't want to have to worry about it no more." What did she tell you though? What did she tell you would happen? I don't know, I forgot. You forgot or you don't want to tell me? I forgot. I'm trying to remember. I don't think you forgot. Once again, the interviewer is not accepting the child's initial answer. Although we talked about how children sometimes use I don't know to indicate that they're not comfortable, in this case the child legitimately did not know or remember, but the interviewer is not accepting this. Interviewers sometimes also use conformity press to disconfirm the child's answers. Conformity press generally means telling the child about the statements of others or the child's own statement and should be avoided in an interview. Here are some examples of conformity press. Billy and Tina both said that Mr. Smith touched them in a bad way. Did he touch you too? This is problematic because the child might now feel peer pressured into saying that Mr. Smith also touched him. Your mom said that she caught you with the babysitter in your room with the door closed, and she thought something bad was happening. This is also problematic because the child may now want to be consistent with his mother's statement. Additionally, both examples show the interviewer introducing new information that the child hasn't previously mentioned. Research has shown that this is suggestive and can lead to false memories. The idea is that in an interview, you're trying to get the child to freely recall information, and by making them aware of other statements or their own previous statements, they're no longer just relying on their own memory of events. This has also been called peer pressure or influence. Another thing you don't want to do in a forensic interview is to encourage the child to guess or speculate. We already addressed this to some extent in the previous module when we talked about I don't know responses. The purpose of teaching the child that he or she can say I don't know or I don't remember is to avoid having them think that they need to guess a response. However, it is important to attend to this throughout the interview as well. Here are some examples of encouraging speculation. How many times did he do that to you? I don't know. What if you had to guess? Such questions are problematic not only because they elicit inaccurate information, but because they may cause the child to subsequently incorporate the guessed information into their narrative. Example 2. How many times did he do that to you? Maybe 4 times? Tell me about the last time he did something to you. In this case, the interviewer accepted the child's maybe answer and moved on. Instead, the interviewer should have clarified that the child actually remembered the alleged abuse happening 4 times instead of guessing. The interviewer should have also informed the child that he or she could say, "I don't know," or "I don't remember," if he or she didn't really remember the number of times. The last thing to avoid in an interview is differentially reinforcing the child's responses. But first, a little background into learning theory. Basic principles of operant learning indicate that behavior that is followed by a reinforcer is more likely to increase in the future. Some examples of reinforcers are praise, money, food, and so on. Behavior that is followed by a punisher is more likely to decrease in the future. Examples of punishers are spanking and grounding children when they misbehave. For anyone familiar with behaviorism, I know that operant learning is much more complex than my very brief description above. However, having a basic understanding of reinforcers versus punishers should suffice for our discussion purposes. The idea is that interviewers can do certain things in an interview that make the child more likely to provide some statements and less likely to provide others. For example, if you only appear interested in and pay attention to details that might support the guilt of the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator in this case, this could communicate to the child that he or she should give you more of that. Let's say that you look pleased when a child gives you details of abuse, but confused, neutral, or unhappy when he says that something didn't happen. This could be differentially reinforcing abuse statements. Looking disinterested in details provided by the child that may exculpate the perpetrator could indicate to the child that they should talk less about such details. The message here is that your positive and negative reactions and verbalizations may shape not only the information the child provides, but also the way the child recollects additional information. Because of this, you should really try to provide neutral responses to different kinds of information while reinforcing talking and participating in general. In conclusion, this module has focused on avoiding interviewing mistakes that could potentially introduce suggestibility to the child. The fewer of these that you use, the stronger your interview will be. Here are practical guidelines to minimize suggestibility in the interview. Do rely on open-ended questions such as, "Tell me what happened next, and then what happened?" Do not rely on closed-ended questions including who, what, where, when, why, and multiple choice questions. Do not use leading questions, do not use repetitive questions, and if you must ask a question again, to inform the child that you're not asking again because you want them to change their answer. Do not disconfirm the child's responses. Do not use confirmative press or social influence with the child. Do not encourage the child to guess or speculate. In fact, do actively discourage the child from this speculation. Do not reinforce responses consistent with disclosure of abuse. Do not punish responses inconsistent with disclosure of abuse. Now that you're familiar with some steps for how to conduct an interview, let's move on to how to close the interview and integrate all of the information you have gathered from the child. This is our last module. Module 8. Our last module will focus on how to close the interview with the child and what to do with all of the information you have generated during the interview. The learning objectives are learning how to close the interview with the child, addressing potential future reporting, and integrating interview information and drawing conclusions. After the child has provided a free narrative and you have questioned as much detail about the alleged abuse event or events as you can move on to closing the interview. You want to first ask the child if there's anything else that he or she remembers that I haven't mentioned already, or if there's anything else you haven't asked about that she would like to talk about. For example, "Thank you so much for telling me all about that. Is there anything else you remember, or anything else I haven't asked you about that you think I should know?" You also want to ask the child if she has any questions for you. Children sometimes want to know what will happen to the alleged abuser. Remember to not make any promises you can't keep, such as, "We'll make sure this never happens to you again." Other times, children ask benign questions, such as wanting to find out more about a profession in law enforcement. You also want to praise the child for answering your questions and to tell them they did a good job. You also want to talk to the child about reporting future experiences. To do this, you can use previously mentioned information from the child. For example, let's say the child told you that her stepfather touched her private parts. "Today you told me about your stepdad touching your private part. I want to talk to you about what you might do if this happens again. If someone touches you inappropriately, what could you do? To whom could you tell?" You should conduct the safety discussion even if the child has not reported any abuse during the interview. In that case, you wouldn't be able to bring up a past event. Rather, you could say, "If someone did something that made you feel uncomfortable, what would you do? To whom could you talk, or to whom could you tell?" Lastly, you should give your card to the child and parent and inform them that they can always contact you if the child remembers anything else. You also want to thank the child and validate his or her experience. For example, "Thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. You did a really good job answering my questions. I know this was new. It might have been a little hard. Is there anything else you would like to talk to me about or ask me about? Anything at all? And here's what happens now. I will talk to the members of my team about what you said today, and they will make decisions about what happens next. I don't really know. Any questions?" After you have terminated the interview with the child, you're left with a lot of information that the child has given you. What are you to do with all this information? The following are steps that you should take to integrate and draw conclusions. First, you want to list all relevant hypotheses. For example, the main hypothesis is that Uncle John digitally penetrated Jenny 3 times total. The first 2 times occurred at home and were similar. Both occurred when Jenny got home from school around 3 p.m. Uncle John picked Jenny up from school, babysat her until her mother got home from work at 5:30. When Jenny and Uncle John got home, he asked her to go to her room, followed her in there, closed the door, and sat her on the bed. Uncle John sat next to Jenny, pushed her on her back, pulled down her pants, and inserted one finger in her vagina. He did this for 5 to 10 minutes both times. When he was done, he got up, told her to start her homework, and left the room. The alleged incident in the car took place last week when Uncle John drove Jenny and her younger sister to McDonald's for dinner. Jenny was in the front seat while his sister was in the back. Jenny was wearing a dress, and Uncle John reached under, moved her underwear to the side, and inserted one finger in her vagina. This only lasted several seconds. Step 2. List all potentially supportive and unsupported information. Supportive would be that Sally was able to describe 3 separate incidents. She was consistent in telling me this and the first responder. And I ruled out the following interview problems, and thus Sally's statements cannot be explained by Sally not having sufficient rapport to tell me. I ruled this out because Sally was smiling, cooperative, and gave complete answers instead of 1 or 2 word answers. Sally not knowing that she could say "I don't know." I ruled this out because I covered it in the interview, and throughout the interview Sally said "I don't know" when she didn't know the answer. Sally not knowing that she could say when she couldn't remember something or didn't want to talk about something. I ruled this out because I also covered this in the interview, and when Sally was asked about the length of the first alleged abuse, she said she thought it lasted 5 to 10 minutes. I reminded her that she should not guess. Sally not knowing the difference between truth and a lie, I ruled this out given Sally's age of 13 and successful examples in the interview. Sally not knowing that it was particularly important to tell the truth in the interview. I ruled it out because I covered it in the interview and Sally promised to tell me only the truth. Sally not knowing why she was being interviewed today. I also ruled this out because I addressed this in the interview, and Sally reported that she was there to talk about what her Uncle John had done to her and stated that no one else told her what to say in the interview. Sally not being comfortable discussing certain topics, I ruled this out because I addressed it. Sally attempting to please me with her responses or not challenge me. I also ruled this out because I went over this with her in the interview and she corrected me successfully when we practiced. And then I ruled in the following interview problems, and the Sally's statements may be explained by the fact that Sally was threatened or bribed. I ruled this in because when I asked Sally about threats and bribes, I found out that her uncle, John, told her that if she told someone, he would make sure that he never saw her younger sister again. At this point, you also want to write down all the alternative hypotheses that you have ruled out. So, outcry. I ruled this out, I explored this, and found out that Sally spontaneously told her mother that her uncle abused her. I ruled out stake. After exploring this, and it does not appear anyone would have benefited from the allegations being made. I also ruled out parental or caregiver suggestion. After exploring this, I found out that after Sally told her mom called the police and didn't ask her any questions. I ruled out sufficiency of details because Sally's narrative made sense, had a beginning, middle, and end, and was appropriate for her age. I ruled out any memory problems because Sally didn't have any difficulties remembering details, and when asked if she remembered anything else about the interview, she indicated nothing. I ruled out inconsistencies because Sally did not provide inconsistent details. I also ruled out fantastical details. Sally did not provide these. And I ruled out personological details. I explored this with Sally, and she does not have a mental health history or anything in her history that would influence her ability to tell the truth. Now, it's important to also note the hypotheses that you ruled in that might explain Sally's allegations. So, for example, potential outside contamination. I ruled this in because Sally spoke to a police officer, and this interview was not recorded, so I don't have a whole lot of information. Interview problems. I ruled this in both because of my own interview and the fact that Sally was interviewed by an officer, and I cannot rule out that he didn't use any biasing techniques. And logical implausibilities. I ruled this in because Sally reported that her sister was present during the alleged car incident. I'm waiting on the interview with the sister to confirm or disconfirm this statement. The last step is to stop and let your team integrate all this information. Generally, child sexual abuse investigations are part of a multidisciplinary process. This means that in a team of individuals from various departments, including detectives, nurses, doctors, and social workers, everyone works together to investigate cases of child sexual abuse. Remember that the child statements during forensic interviews is only one piece of information or evidence. Other evidence will come from the medical examination, if one was conducted, from police interviews with witnesses, and so on. This other evidence will continue to support or not support the working hypotheses. And here's a handy guide to organizing interviewing information. Thank you all for attending this training. I hope you learned a lot about basic principles of forensic interviewing, and I appreciate your feedback about how to improve this training. Thank you again.